Welcome back. One of my viewers just asked me a question that reminded me of one of my more frequently asked questions. Is there a difference with a rimfire scope? And he told me to my, well, I shouldn't be surprised, is that people behind the scope counter couldn't tell them what the difference was. I'm a little bit appalled by that, because anybody who's selling scopes should certainly know that there is a difference between a rimfire and a centerfire scope that it goes way beyond simple, quality and pricing. A good rimfire scope is not a cheap scope, not a cheaply made scope whatsoever. A good quality rimfire scope is the same high-grade quality as a good quality centerfire scope by the same company. The differences are quite distinct, however, and they should be. It should not, again, be simply a matter of quality, and I'll talk about that. The principal difference with a rimfire scope should be that its parallax is made to accommodate the ranges that a 22 rimfire or even a 17, any of the rimfire rifles, it's made to accommodate those ranges, which are quite different than a centerfire rifle, which is designed for extended range shooting, well beyond 200, 300, 400 yards. A good quality rimfire scope, rather than having its parallax, its internal parallax set, and when I speak about internal parallax, I'm talking, of course, about non-AO scopes. Non-AO scopes that have no focusing ring on the front or a side focusing knob. They have an internal parallax adjustment for typical hunting grade scopes, for centerfire rifles of around 150 yards. That's the setting that Leupold sets, for instance, for their standard centerfire rifle scopes is 150 yards. That's a good midpoint trajectory for a high-powered rifle, and it takes into account the fact that the aiming point is not all that critical at close range. The aiming point on large game is not that critical. It doesn't go down to 1 or 2 inches. You can be, if parallax, remember now, is, if you watch my scope series, parallax is the apparent movement of the reticle. As your eye moves from one side of the scope to the other, rather than just the entire image moving with the crosshair tends to walk across the target. Even though the crosshair is pointed exactly in the same place, the only thing is moving is your eye, but the crosshair itself appears to move. That's the apparent movement of the reticle. The internal parallax correction that's made at the factory for non-AO scopes situates that parallax at 150 yards typically, sometimes 100 yards. 150 is a far better position for that, because it's more of a midpoint position for people who are shooting out to extended ranges. And that midpoint trajectory, as I say, at close range, even though the parallax correction isn't there, walking across the target of say a deer or any kind of larger game animal by 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches, or whatever at those closer ranges or even more distant ranges is of no significance whatsoever. It's of great significance, however, to a rimfire shooter, somebody who's shooting squirrels at 30 or 40 or 50 yards or 60 yards doesn't want to have his crosshair move by really any amount whatsoever when he's shooting at a squirrel. He has to be right dead on. So that's where a rimfire scope has its principal difference. A good rimfire scope is set up so that the parallax, that internal parallax adjustment at the factory, is set for 50 to 60 yards. Leupold, for instance, sets it for 60 yards for their rimfire scopes. And their rimfire scopes were made to the exact same high standards as their centerfire scopes. You can take a rimfire scope from a Leupold, from the Leupold lineup, and mount it on your 375 H&H Magnum, and it's not gonna suffer any internal damage. You can mount it on top of the highest recoiling spring air rifle, and it's not going to suffer any internal damage. They're made to the same exacting standards. But that internal, one of the differences is that the internal parallax adjustment is situated set at 60 yards, which is an ideal range for the rimfire shooter. The rimfire shooter is typically sighting his rifle, a 22 long rifle is ideally sighted in for 60 yards. That gives you a very good point of impact out to 100 yards without too much apparent drop on the paper, and it gives you very, very good midpoint trajectory at, say, 25 or 30 yards in between. So it's an ideal setting for a 22 long rifle, and that's if you want to know what the best place to sight in your 22 is typically at 60 yards. You can sight it in a little bit closer if you want, that's fine. But if you think that you might be shooting at extended ranges out to 100 to 125 yards or so, 60 yards is a good range. And that's also, as I say, that's right where that internal parallax adjustment is made. The second distinction is typically in the bulk of the scope. Here's my CZ457, and I've got a Leupold 4-power rimfire scope on it. It's perfectly scaled to this rifle. This is an adult-sized rifle. There's no question about it. It's got a long barrel. It's got a full-size stock for my 6'2" 2.5" frame. It fits perfectly, but obviously the bolt is very small and light in mass. The receiver is correspondingly lighter in mass than a centerfire rifle. And the barrel, although the barrel is as heavy and as big as some centerfire rifles, the entire overall picture of this rifle is one of compactness. And that's the perfect package for a rifle of this sort. Compare that, for instance, to this is my Model 70 featherweight. Now, overall, the rifle is about the same size. It's got the same stock length of pull. The barrels are pretty much almost the same in size. However, back here, the barrel is larger in mass because it has to contain a much larger diameter chamber. So it's a larger gun, and this larger scope, it fits the entire picture. This has got a longer receiver, so it also has to have a longer span between these two scope rings, which is not necessarily the case with a rimfire scope, because the span is much, much shorter. You can see the difference in span right here. So the receiver is shorter by at least an inch. So you've got a significant difference in size between these two instruments. Both exactly the same quality. I could just as well swap these scopes, and there'd be no difference whatsoever in their performance. But the parallax wouldn't be correct for either one, and that's the significant difference, that and the bulk. Now, there's a third difference, and I think that this is also very, very important. It's the typical size of the crosshair thickness. In other words, the crosshair thickness, what it subtends at various ranges. The centerfire scope has got, you could call it a fine center on that duplex reticle. You know, the outside portion of the reticle is thick, and the inside portion of that reticle is quite fine. But compared to this rimfire scope, the entire picture is different. This is about 50% lighter all around. The outside thickness of this crosshair is actually almost the same size as the inside thickness on the centerfire scope. So that's another important distinction, especially when you're shooting small game. And you know, if you want to be shooting at Necco wafers or chestnuts or something like that at 15 or 20 yards, this is the kind of crosshair you want that doesn't obscure those small targets. If you're taking headshots on squirrels, you want to have a very fine crosshair that you can look up in the trees and you can put the crosshair on his eyeball. So that's why this is also a very, very good selection. There is an alternative, and by the way, you know, you can get rimfire scopes with all the same features. You can get rimfire scopes with, you know, adjustable objectives. You can get rimfire scopes with variable power. That one happens to be a fixed 4-power scope. As a matter of fact, my very first rifle was a 582. Well, let's try to think of the 572 Remington. I did a video on it. It's a pump action 22 Remington that I had when I was a kid, and it was my first purchase that I made with my paper route. I bought a B6 Weaver scope. Now, it's not the same Weaver company that's in business anymore. This was a company down in Texas that made. They probably were the most popular scope back in the 50s, 60s, and even early 70s. Weaver was a very, very big name in scopes at the time, with their K model scopes for centerfires. They had a J model, which was a mid-grade scope, which was often very popular for 22s and centerfires. And they had the B model, which was for the 4-power scope, it was $8.50, and for the 6-power scope, it was $12.50. And that $12.50, after my expenses, having lunch for the week, delivering papers, that $12.50 was exactly what I needed at the end of my week to mount a scope on that rifle. And I slew many woodchucks and squirrels with that little combination of a 3/4-inch diameter tube. I think I've seen a lot of those scopes these days on the rack through the years, and the teardrop shaped turret cap, it was just pressed on, it just clicked on, and that usually wore out after a while, and it became lost. So most of those old B model scopes no longer have a turret cap. And that scope was it was one of the last scopes that had a non-centered reticle. In other words, it was a non-constantly centered reticle. So as you turned your adjustment turrets, the crosshairs actually moved up and down. And so you could have, if you didn't have a well-oriented scope, in other words, if somebody didn't drill and tap that receiver the way it's supposed to be, you could have the crosshairs up in the upper or lower corner of that scope someplace, and it was rather peculiar. So that was a big invention, you know. I mean, I'm getting off track, but that was a big invention with scopes, to have a constantly centered reticle where the crosshair was always in the middle of the scope. That was a big deal when it first came out. But here's another option. This is much, much larger scope than either of the others, but this is also a viable option. This happens to be my Beeman R7 Spring Air, and I put a Hawk scope on it, and this is a variable. What is this? A 4 to? I'm sorry. This is a 3 to 9. So 3 to 9 variable, but as you can see, this is a substantial size scope. It's got a very, very large ocular lens. It's got a rather bulky front end here. But it's a very, very high grade quality optic. It cost me only $97 back about 3 years ago. But it's, again, it's, you know, you have to make a decision. Do you want to have such a large scope as that on a rimfire rifle? My preference is, you know, with a Springer, that extra mass is a good thing when it comes to dampening recoil and keeping you on target. But with a 22, I prefer to have that smaller configuration. So that's a rather subjective observation. Those, you know, most standard rimfire scopes will focus down to about the same distance that their counterparts would in the centerfire scope line. So they'll focus down typically to around 10 or 12 yards or so, and that's usually sufficient. When I say focus, I'm talking about sharp focus. You can still take a shot at a if a you know, squirrel happens to appear 8 or 10 yards, 6 or 8 yards away. You're still going to be able to hit them. There's no question about it. But there's going to be fuzzy images until you get to about 10 or 12 yards. This scope here will focus down to about 3.5 yards on the low power 3-power setting, and with the objective lens cranked all the way to the bottom. So, I mean, this has got virtually infinite adjustment from 3.5 yards, less than 3 paces, all the way out to wherever, to infinity. So that's an option. Keeping that sort of scope can keep your cost down, and it can still result in having a scope which has the parallax set exactly at the distance that you want. Because parallax occurs at the same place as precise focus does. So when the precise focus is set for 8 yards with this scope, it's going to be right dead on. The parallax is going to be precisely on at that same distance, and all the way out to wherever you happen to dial in that ring. So that's the entire story where it comes to rimfire scopes. Don't get sold a centerfire scope or a non-AO scope for a rimfire rifle. It's not the way to go. For one thing, you're going to be probably paying far more than you need to. A typical loophole scope with the same features as that 4-power fixed scope is going to be probably 30% more money than 30 or 40% more money than the rimfire model, because you're dealing with more raw materials. As you can see, that's a smaller scope, and it's less aluminum involved, less glass involved. Everything about it is scaled down, and this is really my favorite scope when it comes to a rimfire rifle. I mean, it's as sharp as a tack at any range. You've seen me shoot this with this scope. This happens to be the 22 Rimfire Magnum barrel on it, but I've shot this also with the 22 long rifle barrel. It's a very, very nice scope. I can see with this 4-power, you've seen me shoot at 3/4-inch orange dots, and I can see it precisely. And this scope will bisect at 60 yards. This scope will bisect that 3/4-inch dot very easily. I can shoot it 1/2-inch dots like nothing. So that's it. I thank my viewer for prompting me on that topic, because it's something that I am asked quite frequently in one way or the other. So that's all there is to it. Benny is looking at me like he wants to go do something, and I don't blame him. Tomorrow we're supposed to be getting slammed with up to 2 feet of snow up in our parts. So we got the snow blower mounted. We're ready to go. Nothing to it. We'll rock and roll, huh, Benny? And I thank my Patreon donors for all their assistance, their kind assistance. And I know I'll be back before Christmas, but if I'm not, I wish everybody a very, very merry and Holy Christmas. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. God bless.